Have you heard of representation piggybacking? Yeah, that's a thing. I made it up, but it's still a thing. And if you understand representation piggybacking, you'll understand how this concept of representation relates to every other concept that you have learned in this module.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Before we get started, I just want to say well done. This is the last concept that you need to understand in English ATAR. The lesson after this one is a bonus lesson that discusses some very simple but nonetheless extremely important points. The good news is that this concept of representation or representation piggybacks off all the other concepts that we've already learned about in this module. It doesn't necessarily require new learning about a new concept. This will make sense when we get further into the lesson, but in the meantime, obviously make sure you've watched all the previous lessons to this one and completed the related activities, because obviously if this concept piggybacks off the other concepts, you need to understand what those concepts are all about before you can actually understand what this one is all about. Here are all the times the concept representation or a version of that word representation, represent, represented, etc. has appeared in a past WACE exam question between 2016 and 2022. I think that is the last time I will be saying that sentence. Once in 2016, 4 times in 2017, 4 times in 2018, twice in 2019, once in 2021, and once in 2022. Didn't come up in 2020. Likely to come up in yours. Relevant syllabus points, we've got 2, one from each unit. In Unit 3, analysing and evaluating how different texts represent similar ideas in different ways. And Unit 4, the ways viewpoints and values are represented. Plan of attack for the lesson. What are we going to do? We will firstly define representation. We'll outline the elements of the definition. We'll answer question 1, which is how does a text creator represent something in a text? Then we'll answer question 2. Is the text creator significant when it comes to the representations made in a text? Question 3. What does represent mean? That little hyphen changes represent to represent. Then question 4. What can be represented? After that, I'll explain representation piggybacking. I bet you cannot wait to hear that. Then I'll discuss some examples. We'll analyze past WACE exam questions, or as this typo says, analyze a past WACE exam questions. Very good, Lennox. Pat on the back. Then explain how to approach analytical questions, explain how to approach creative questions, and then outline a simple summary. First up, our definition of representation. This is what the SCARSA glossary has to say about it. Representation refers to the way people, events, issues, or subjects are presented in a text. The term implies that texts are not mirrors of the real world. They are constructions of reality. These constructions are partially shaped through the writer's use of conventions and techniques. We will return to one sentence of this definition shortly, but in the meantime, here is our overarching definition of representation. It is the way a text creator represents something. What are the elements of this definition? There are 4, and each element raises a question. Those 4 questions that we outlined in the lesson objectives. We'll be spending the majority of this lesson answering those questions. Our first element is the way. Our next element is a text creator. Next element is represent. And last element is something. Now let's check out the questions that each element raises. Firstly, number 1 is how does a text creator represent something in a text? Then, why is the text creator significant when it comes to the representations of a text? Third question, what does represent mean? Fourth question, what can be represented? If you know the answer to each one of these questions, then you understand this concept of representation or representation in English ATAR. Let's start off by answering the first question, which is how does a text creator represent something in a text? A key takeaway, a text creator represents something in a text through the use of language features, including stylistic choices and features, structural devices, and generic conventions. Let's talk about language features first. Question to ask: how do language features work to represent something in a text? Here is an example. Language features such as costume, facial expression, posture, gaze, gestures, and focal point represent Vito Corleone, this dude, in The Godfather as powerful, authoritative, and composed. How about structural features? Question to ask: how do structural features work to represent something in the text? Here's an example. The chronological structure of the movie 1917 represents a snapshot of World War I in a raw, unrelenting, and harrowing way. Finally, genre expectations. Our question is: how does the text treatment of generic conventions work to represent something? An example is Steve Jobs. Danny Boyle is the director of this Steve Jobs movie, the one starring Michael Fassbender, not the one starring Ashton Kutcher. It's conventional for movies to use one format, such as using the same aspect ratio throughout or using the same camera, such as the same type of film camera or a digital camera. Danny Boyle, the director, subverted that expectation by representing 3 different product launches of Apple in 3 different formats. According to IMDb, this was done to illustrate the advancement in Apple's technology across the 16 years of Jobs' life depicted. So that is question number 1. How does a text creator represent something? They represent something through the use of language features, structural features, or genre expectations. Question number 2 is: why is the text creator significant when it comes to the representations made in a text? Starting with a key takeaway, the text creator is significant when it comes to the representations made in a text because their context influences the nature of the representation. Let's explain that a little bit. What that key takeaway is really saying is that the text creator's cultural context and situational context influence how things are represented in a text. The things that are happening in the text creator's specific environment and general environment are influencing the way that text creator represents things in the text that they create. Here is a familiar example. We've got the context surrounding Alex Garland's production of the movie Ex Machina. Regarding the cultural context, the rate of technological advancement in the 2000s and early 2010s enabled big tech companies to start developing machine learning algorithms. These algorithms teased the reality of sentient machines in the future. That right there is a socio-cultural feature of the cultural context. Regarding the situational context, hopefully you'll remember that Garland had an epiphany for the idea of Ex Machina while reading a book about consciousness and embodiment. That book informed Garland's representation of training, validating, and testing the humanoid AI for accuracy. Put differently, that book informed the way the director represented the way the AI in the movie is trained. So to zoom out and reassess what this question is that we're answering: why is the text creator significant when it comes to the representations made in a text? The text creator is significant because their context, whether it's their cultural context or situational context, influences the way representations are made. Question number 3, what does represent mean? I mentioned a little bit earlier that we're going to return to one part of the SCASA glossary definition of representation. This is the part that I was referring to. The term implies that texts are not mirrors of the real world, they are constructions of reality. This sentence refers to the most important thing you need to know when it comes to the concept of representation. And that is, everything we see in a text is merely a version of reality. Everything we see is represented or presented again. Let's tease this out a little bit. How is that key takeaway relevant to you? Well, whenever any form of the word represent, i.e. represented, representation, etc., appears in an exam question, you should think represent. Why is the hyphen between the E and the P so important? The hyphen emphasizes the fact that the text creator represents something in the text that was originally presented to them in their situational and/or cultural context. Relating this to the Ex Machina example, Alex Garland represented ideas that he read in the book about consciousness and embodiment through his depiction of the way the AI was trained in the movie. Here is another example. Inglourious Basterds, Quentin Tarantino, 2009. Definitely in my top 15, maybe top 10. Link to the trailer is in the resources tab below the video. Give it a watch. Return to this lesson once you are finished watching that trailer. If you haven't seen the movie before, we're essentially getting an alternate history of the final moments of World War II. Tarantino, the director, at some point in his life was presented with the fact that Hitler died by suicide by swallowing a cyanide capsule and shooting himself in the head. That right there is a historical feature. Tarantino represented this historical event in Inglourious Basterds by telling a story about a group of American Jewish men who successfully execute their plan to kill Hitler by burning him alongside other Nazi leaders in a theater. This is the reality. This is what happened. This is the fictional representation of what happened. Note that this is a fictional representation. The movie Inglourious Basterds is fictional, but representations occur in every text, regardless of whether it is fictional or non-fictional. For instance, a documentary represents information about a given topic. That's question number 3. Moving on to our fourth and final question, what can be represented? A key takeaway to answer this question, virtually anything can be represented in a text. That doesn't really clarify things for the purposes of answering this question, so here are some things that are commonly represented. Context, concepts, themes, issues, ideas, people, characters, relationships, perspectives, plots, events, experiences, settings, values and attitudes, and voices. Hence, virtually anything can be represented. And those are our 4 questions answered. Gosh, we are making good time. Let's move on to representation piggybacking. Woo! At the start of this lesson, I said that this concept of representation piggybacks off several other concepts that you have already learned about. So the question arises, what do I mean by piggybacking? Suppose you see one person who we will call the piggybacker giving another person who we'll call the piggybackee a piggyback. In this case, you will likely focus on the piggybacker because they're the one doing most of the work. This little kid is just chilling on the back having a nap. But the dad, he's the one lifting the weight. You'll acknowledge the existence of the piggybackee, but the piggybacker is the main focus. The same thing can be said in English ATAR of the relationship between the concept of representation and the other elements in the question. The piggybacker is the main focus of the question. The main focus of the question is the other elements in the question. Note that the other elements in the question just refers to those 8 things that we listed off in answering question 4. These 8 things are the other elements in the question. On the other hand, the piggybackee is the secondary focus of the question. In other words, the concept of representation is the secondary focus when you're answering a question. All of this is to say that the concept of representation rides on the back of other elements in the question. It is not the main focus of the question. The easiest way to explain this is to take a look at some of those past WACE exam questions that were displayed at the beginning of the lesson. I've listed 6 past questions in the relevant section of the PDF study notes. We'll discuss questions 2, 3, 5, and 6 now, and then we'll address questions 1 and 4 in the next section of this lesson. How is the father-son relationship represented through the construction of the narrator's voice? The main focus of the question, the piggybacker, is the father-son relationship. The secondary focus of the question, the piggybackee, is the concept represented. Next question, compare how 2 texts of different modes use textual features to represent a similar idea or theme. The main focus of the question, the piggybacker, is this part of it, a similar idea or theme. The secondary focus of the question, the piggybackee, is the concept of represent. Next, analyze how the central character's attitudes are represented through the narrative point of view used in text 2. Main focus of the question, the piggybacker, is the central character's attitude, this part of the question. The secondary focus of the question, the piggybackee, is the term represented. Finally, compose an interpretive text which represents a common event or experience in a new light. Main focus of the question, the piggybacker, is this part, a common event or experience. The secondary focus of the question, the piggybackee, is this part, the concept of represents. The key takeaway from this exercise that we've just gone through is that when answering a question that includes the concept of representation, focus on the other elements and remember that those elements are simply a version of reality. They have been represented. Finally, let's check out some past WACE exam questions, starting with how to approach analytical questions, which, as we know very well by this stage, refer to questions in the comprehending section and responding section. For these questions, you should focus on what is represented, for instance, an idea, and how it is represented, for instance, language features, and be aware that the representation is a version of reality. An example, discuss how your attitudes influence your response to the way a controversy is represented in at least one text. In this question, the words "a controversy" is the piggybacker, the main focus of the question. And it should come as no surprise that represented is the secondary focus of the question, the piggybackee. Let's check out a sample response excerpt to see what all of this looks like in action. The game changes represents the controversy of whether plant-based or meat-based protein is superior. My skeptical and dismissive attitudes towards plant-based diets influenced my resistant response to the way the game changes represents the controversy above. My response is resistant because the text makes several sensational implications that made me question the credibility of its findings. Those implications included that eating plant-based over meat-based protein can improve erectile function in 24 hours and that plant-based protein enabled the focalizer of the text, James Wilkes, to dramatically increase how long he could use battle ropes, a form of conditioning exercise, at the gym. Some comments based on this excerpt. My understanding of representation in this paragraph is reflected most clearly in this sentence. My skeptical and dismissive attitudes towards plant-based diets influence my resistant response to the way the game changes represents the controversy above. This sentence tells the marker that I'm aware that the controversy of plant-based versus meat-based protein is represented in the text such that the former is favored over the latter. Said differently, this text is representing that controversy in such a way that favors plant-based protein over meat-based protein. Ultimately, this sentence is telling the marker that I'm aware that the representation is just a version of reality put forward by the text creator. So that is how we approach analytical questions. We explain what is represented, how it is represented, and be aware that the representation is just a version of reality. For creative questions, we know they come from the composing section of the exam. And when it comes to dealing with the concept of representation for these questions, you should focus on what you represent, for example, an idea, and how you represent it. For example, you use first-person point of view and an unreliable narrator. Where did the R go? So you're focusing on what you represent, how you represent it, and once again, you should be aware that your representation, your representation, is just a version of reality. Here's a sample question. Compose an interpretive text to represent an encounter with a person who taught you something about yourself. In this instance, the main focus of the question, the piggybacker, is this part of it, an encounter. As we know by this point, the secondary focus of it, the piggybackee, is the term represent. Let's see how we could answer this question in a sample excerpt response. I met David, a man who would prove to be a lifelong mentor and friend. He taught me something about myself that has helped me rebound from feelings of loneliness, hopelessness, and everything in between. You might be experiencing those feelings at the moment. You might not. Either way, we've all experienced them at some point, and we've all bounced back somehow. Reflecting on how we bounced back helps us to do so faster in the future. And that's really what today's post is all about. I'll be reflecting on my life before meeting David, what happened during the encounter with David, and my life after meeting David, in the hope that you'll recall how you got through a hard time and remind yourself of your own strength. This excerpt is part of a blog post introduction that we'll be analyzing in Module 5. How does this excerpt tackle or address those main parts of the question? In short, I'll be addressing the represent part of the question when I discuss what happened during the encounter with David. Really, what I'm saying here is that I will adequately address the represent part of the question simply by describing an encounter. The main focus of the question, the piggybacker, is an encounter. The secondary focus of the question, the piggybackee, is represent. I will be sufficiently representing an encounter simply by describing it in this interpretive text, which is a blog post. Nice and easy. And that is all the main content for the lesson. Look at that efficiency. Let's do a simple summary of it. First part of this lesson, we looked at the definition of representation, which is the way a text creator represents something. We know that there are 4 elements of that definition. The first one is the way. This requires us to answer the question, how does a text creator represent something in a text? The second element is a text creator. The related question is, why is the text creator significant when it comes to the representations made in a text? The next element is represents. This question is, what does represent mean? And the final element is something. The related question is, what can be represented? We then moved on to focusing on question 1. How does a text creator represent something in a text? And a key takeaway here was that a text creator represents something in a text through the use of language features, including stylistic choices and features, structural devices, and generic conventions. Question number 2 is, why is the text creator significant when it comes to the representations made in a text? The short answer is because context. The text creator is significant when it comes to the representations made in a text because his, her, their context influences the nature of the representation. For instance, technological advancement in the early 21st century influenced Garland's representation of the AI's brain in Ex Machina. Question number 3, what does represent mean? In short, everything we see in a text is merely a version of reality. Everything we see is represented or presented again. Another key takeaway, whenever any form of the word represent, i.e. represented, representation, etc., appears in an exam question, you should think represent. You should put the hyphen between the E and the P. So represent becomes represent, or represented becomes represented, or representation becomes representation. You get the idea. Example, Tarantino represented Hitler's death in his movie Inglourious Basterds by having him burned alive in a theater. Question number 4, what can be represented? Virtually anything can be represented in a text. But if we're going to specify things that can be represented into a list, we would have context, concepts, themes, issues, ideas, people, characters, relationships, perspectives, plots, events, experiences, settings, values and attitudes, and voice or voices. Next section of the lesson, representation piggybacking. We learned in this section of the lesson the piggybacker, or the main focus, equals the other elements in the question, the elements that aren't the representation concept, and the piggybackee, the secondary focus, is representation. Key takeaway, the concept of representation rides on the back of other elements in the question. It is not the main focus. Another key takeaway, when answering a question that includes the concept of representation, focus on the other elements and remember that those elements are simply a version of reality. They have been represented. Final main section of the lesson, past WACE exam questions. Firstly, we looked at how to approach analytical questions. Here, we saw that we should focus on what is presented and how it is presented, and be aware that the representation is just a version of reality. Finally, we discussed how to approach creative questions similar to analytical, but with a few little tweaks. You should focus on what you represent and how you represent it. And of course, you should be aware that your representation is a version of reality. That's it for today's lesson. We smashed that out. Look at us go. As I said at the beginning of this lesson, this is the last concept that you need to know about in English ATAR. Once you complete the activities for this lesson, you will have officially learned every concept you need to know about in English ATAR. Of course, you can only claim that you have learned every concept in the course once you complete that activity. It is just one text table and it's pretty easy. That one text table is significant because once you complete it, you will have all of your study notes for the WACE exam and any other exams that you have before that. And once you complete it, that means you've completed the last set of activities for this module. This is huge news. So go and smash that table out, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson, which is the bonus lesson. Until then, keep it simple.